Amen. What's up, guys? Man, I hope that y'all have had a good week. I'm really excited about this series that we're in. What do you do when God doesn't? What do you do when God doesn't? We're going to be in Habakkuk 3 weeks, and then Trevor's going to share one of the weeks. This title that turned into a series actually came from the message that he's going to share, which I'm very, very excited about. But we're going to press into some issues and some struggles and some tension that I think that we all struggle with. Most of us have struggled with, but we all are pretty much guaranteed to struggle with at times in our lives. And so we're going to be in the book of Habakkuk. If you have never heard of that book, a lot of people have not read this book, but there's a lot to offer. I would go to the table of contents to find it, because I would tell you that it's after Nahum, but Nahum is one page in my Bible. And so I don't think it's going to be extremely helpful if I say after that. If it's any help at all, there's also Micah, which is another like 5 or 6 pages. But table of contents is probably your best bet. So turn there, and we're going to be in the hook of Habakkuk. Wow, awesome start. The book of Habakkuk for the next few weeks together, answering the question, what do you do when God doesn't? And to give us traction for where we're going this evening, whenever I was in elementary school, I had field day. Who here had field day in elementary school? Hey, field day rocks, man. Like, it was awesome. So like the potato sack races, earlier today I was talking and I said the tater sack races, and I was like, welcome to West Texas, y'all. We're going to be having tater sack races, and I don't know. But the potato sack races, they were always one of my favorite, not because I like to race, but because I like to see my friends eat dirt when they fell. It was awesome, but it was awful, but it was awesome. And so I love that. But every year, whenever we had our different stations that we would go to, like you do in field day, my favorite was the pull-up bar challenge that was at our school. And so our gym had a pull-up bar in it, and the challenge was the teacher would have a whiteboard next to the pull-up bar, and the challenge was who could hold themselves in a pull-up position the longest without letting their chin drop below the bar. And so I love this competition because I was actually good at it, and I actually I was the best at it a couple years in a row. I peaked in elementary, but hey, I'm going to take my W's where I can get them. And so whenever it came to the pull-up challenge, what would happen is about a minute and 20 in, people would start shaking and the tension would happen. But I would train for this. So for me, it was a little longer. So like when I mean train, what I would do is like we would go to the restroom and I would go pee. And then as long as there wasn't someone in the stall, because that would be weird. It's kind of like these toilets are ginormous kind of moment. Elf, if anybody didn't catch that. But as long as there wasn't anyone in the stall, I would jump up on the stall and I would hold myself up there for as long as I could to like train for this pull-up challenge. And so whenever, I know that's way too serious, but that's what happened. But about a minute and 20 in, whenever someone would be pulling themselves up, holding themselves in the pull-up position, you would start to see, like, that's whenever it would get really, really tense, and they would start the uncontrollable shaking. You know what I'm talking about? If y'all have ever done anything to the point of exhaustion physically, then you know what I'm talking about. But they would hold themselves up and everything, and you could tell that they're about to drop at any single moment, and that's when all the students around would start saying, hey, hang on, just hang in there, just hang in there. And then at about 2 minutes, usually that's whenever everyone would start giving up and dropping. And that's usually where the record was, 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, not that anybody cares. But I will say now I get that same feeling about a minute and 20 into the treadmill run. And so about a minute and 20, I'm good. And I'm like, this is hell on earth from this point on for the next 7-8 minutes I'm on this thing to try to get the mile in. And so the reason why I share that, though, and I know it's a silly example, but I think that we can all resonate with times in our lives where we are holding on in life and we're given everything that we've got, but the tension starts to build and we start to feel like, man, I don't know if I can hang on any longer. And that's the moment, just like the gym teacher and the students would say, hang in there. That's the moment that God is going to come and say, hey, hang in there with me. And that's what is happening with Habakkuk chapter 1. Habakkuk is just barely hanging in there by a thread. And God is saying, you've got to continue hanging in there. And that's what he's going to be teaching us tonight. And to give you more of a real life example, more personal example, whenever Carrie and I, when Carrie was pregnant with Bridget, our first daughter, she's 6 now, so this is a little bit ago. But when she was pregnant with Bridget, we were at church, and she was very, very sick, and I've shared about this a few times before, but she was very, very sick, could not keep anything down, and she had already been to the hospital once or twice at this point, but she was actually on our pastor's couch that he had in his office, laying down because she was that ill and couldn't really hold herself up. She was so weak, and we were calling the doctor, trying to find out what we need to do, and the doctor calls back and answers and says, hey, you're going to need to come to the hospital. And so I'm dealing with that frustration. And in the middle of this conversation with the doctor, there are tornado sirens that start going off outside of the building. And so there's a tornado warning going off outside. So there's literally a physical storm going on outside. And then there's this storm that we have with Carrie's health going on the inside. And I was there just thinking like, man, are you serious? Like I can't even go to the hospital now. Now I just have to sit here and watch her suffer more. And at that moment, that's whenever the pastor came to me and said, hey, this too shall pass, which didn't help me at all. Like I knew it was true, but I was like, no, like I want to know what I need to do. Like, how can I fix this? And matter of fact, God, why don't you step in and do something about this situation? But all I could do was hold on to the pastoral statement, hey, which it didn't help me in the moment, but it did help me later on. But this too shall pass. And all I could do was just hold on and hang in there. And that's where we arrive with Habakkuk. We're about to see this prophet of God, this man of God, and he's hurting, he's afraid, and he's afraid that he's about to drop. And he's holding on with all that he's got. And the flow of this first chapter is that Habakkuk asks questions to God. God responds, and then Habakkuk asks more questions, and the tension is unresolved. And that's where we're going to leave off tonight, with the tension still hanging in there. So let's read Habakkuk chapter 1 together. God has, I think, much that he wants to teach us. We're going to read a good chunk of scripture, and then we're going to kind of talk through it the rest of our time together. Starting in verse 1, it says, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not heal, or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Look among the nations and see. This is God responding, starting in verse 5. So God answers, look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation. So this wicked group of people is what God is talking about. Wicked army. Who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence. All their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. So he's saying like these people are a powerful, wicked, evil force. And he's saying, I'm raising them up to come for Israel. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men, whose own might is their God. Are you not from everlasting? This is Habakkuk responding. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are pure of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his drag net, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his drag net, for by them he lives in luxury. And his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Good chipper passage that we have to go through this evening. But Habakkuk starts by pressing into questions that we all ask, questions that I think we all have. And so he's going to say, how long shall I cry? In verse 2, how long should I cry for help and you will not hear? And the question he's asking is a question we all ask. God, why aren't you listening? And he says, he's talking very personally. He says, I cry for help. Why aren't you answering me? And I think that many of us anyway, have heard the truth that God is always there, right? So we press into that. We talk about that a lot, even here. But then what happens in our lives, there are times in our lives where we start to experience the exact opposite, that God actually doesn't seem like he's there at all. That we're begging God, just like Habakkuk's begging God, and we find silence on the other end. Well-known author and theologian C.S. Lewis lost his wife to cancer. And in a book called A Grief Observed, he talks about his experience, and it's basically his raw diary to God. But in that diary, after he lost his wife, he says this. He says, go to God when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. And after that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. So this guy that's one of the most prolific writers in recent Christian history, one of the most well-known theologians, he's saying, this is how I feel, God. This is the experience that I have. And I think that many of us, we've felt a version of this ourselves. Maybe not quite to that intensity, but some of us we have. And for some of us, maybe it was that you prayed for God to heal your parents' marriage, and the divorce still happened. And you were thinking, I know that they made that decision, but God, I felt like you're just absent for me right now. Maybe it's the depression that it comes and it goes, but right now it's come back with a vengeance, and you're crying. You don't understand why it's back the way that it is. We prayed for someone that was their prayer request this evening before tonight at 6:00. We prayed for someone that was something that they're dealing with. So I know you're in the room tonight, that this is your struggle, that you're going like, why am I feeling this way? And where is God in this? And why hasn't God responded to me? And maybe like I've met with several people this semester that have talked about, man, I'm lonely. I'm just experiencing very, very great loneliness. And the truth is that sometimes you can experience loneliness and you cry out to God, and God seems distant too in moments. And so not a comfortable thing to press into, but a question that a lot of people have. And then he says this in verse 2, at the second part, he says, I cry to you violence. I cry to you violence, and you will not save. Why am I crying? And you're not, the question that we ask and that he's pressing into is God, why don't you deliver? Why don't you deliver me? Why don't you deliver this situation? Why don't you change things? Because I know that you can. When Maddie, there's a little girl named Maddie, and she was at Carrie's school. Carrie was a Bible teacher. My wife, Carrie, she was a Bible teacher and a music teacher at this little Christian private school. And Maddie was one of the girls in her group, in her class. And Maddie ended up getting diagnosed with brain cancer when she was 4 years old. And we prayed for this little girl. And we prayed that it would go away. And the most gut-wrenching thing is that, man, like, it did. And we celebrated. I announced it to our deacon body, the servants in our church at the time. We all clapped our hands. And a couple months later, it came back. Ended up taking her life. And I think, and it's so frustrating for me because I think, God, I know you're good. I know I believe some things about you, and I do. I believe that God's good, but I'm going, tell me something good about that. Tell me why there would be false hope given to this mom and dad and to this girl. And it's extremely difficult whenever I think about that. I think, God, why didn't you deliver? And I think that there's across the room, we could have our own stories. We could share that. And that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying, that is violence. I cry to you, violence. And I think that across the room, we can agree. Something like that, we go, yeah, violence. It shouldn't be that way. And so he asks God, why don't you deliver? And then in verses 3 and 4, it says, why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? So he's just, you're not doing anything. If destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. And then it says, so the law is paralyzed. Here he's talking about the people group that he's surrounded by. The people of Judah were living against God. And so this word paralyzed could actually be translated numb as well, as another way to translate that. And so what he's trying to say is that the law of God and God's desires have no effect on the people, and they're numb to God. in his ways and his will. And he's going like, why are all these people living wickedly around me? For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted, is how verse 4 ends. And so the question is, God, why don't you do something? Why don't you deliver? And then why don't you do something? And he's not saying that you cannot. He's not looking at God going, God, you can't do anything. It's actually because God can and he's not. It's not that you cannot, but it's that you will not. A wrestling match that I think most men and women of God, people that of the faith, people that are trying to seek the Lord have is, God can change this, so why doesn't he? Have y'all felt that before? Like, have y'all had that question? Have y'all wrestled deep inside with that? I think a lot of us have. God can do something, so why isn't he? In Habakkuk, I appreciate Habakkuk, and one of the things that make this book powerful, one is the word of God, but Habakkuk is speaking from raw emotion here, and all the evil that he's seeing, he's in a place just like some of us have been in, where it's hard to hold on to God's promises and remember his past faithfulness in this moment. So he's going to say things like, oh, you never, like justice is never going forth. And I think in moments we kind of find ourselves where it's just easy to forget that God has been faithful in the past, and God does have promises, and he does have a future for us. He does have a plan for us. And so what he does here, instead of just staying there, he actually takes his question to God, and then God responds starting in verse 5, and it is a shocking response. Absolutely shocking response in a bad way for Habakkuk. If Habakkuk could speak in right there, he'd go, that's not what I wanted to hear. What God is telling Habakkuk is things are about to get worse. So to wrap up verses 5 through 11, God says the Chaldeans are coming. This wicked nation, it is coming. I'm raising them up. And they're coming, and they're a force to be reckoned with, and they are collecting captives and slaves like their sand on the seashore, to explain them. And so it's not a very good thing. But what we can get, there are some uncomfortable truths that I think we need to get tonight from this passage, so we can see some uncomfortable truths about God's responses to our prayers. So as we cry out to God, what can we learn about God's responses to our prayers from these verses? Well, one, God's answers don't answer all our questions. God's answers do not answer all of our questions. Verse 3, he asks, why is he idly watching all the wrong? And then God's response is, hey, more wrong is on its way. More evil is on its way. And so imagine like you being Habakkuk right now. Imagine like this is you, and you cried out to God, and God wasn't answering. And when he finally does, he's like, by the way, it's about to get way worse. Buckle up. And imagine that would be like, how many more questions must Habakkuk have had? He was expecting some sort of master plan of deliverance to be laid out for him. Like, that's what I would want. Just like whenever Carrie was sick and we were at the church, and I was in the middle of two storms going on simultaneously. And I was like, I wanted to know the step-by-step process, Lord. And God didn't give that. God didn't answer his questions at all. Actually, his answer and his response caused, no doubt, more questions for Habakkuk. I remember listening to a woman. She's the wife of Rick Warren, and Rick Warren is a well-known pastor, wrote a very famous book called The Purpose-Driven Life. But Rick Warren, his wife, she was sharing about their son's suicide, and this was not extremely long after it happened, maybe within the first year or year and a half or so. And she talked about all the difficulties that she experienced with that loss. And in that, she talked about how she has this box. And she said, I have this box where I put every time I have a question that I feel like God's not answering and that I don't know the answer to, I put that question in this box for my question box for God. And she said, I have dozens of questions that I've asked God that he hasn't answered, that I haven't sensed him giving me an answer or a reason why or so on and so forth. And the freeing part of it was the point that she was making, is that there are questions. We're free to question, but also there are questions that will not be answered on this side of heaven. The question about Maddie, the why question about Maddie, I'm not gonna pretend like I could ever answer that question. And there's people that sit across from me and they say why, and I can't pretend like I know the answer to why there's little children that are dying And I think that that's okay, and that's where it needs to be, is in that box of questions that we won't have the answer to on this side of heaven. But what God did give her, and what God did give Habakkuk, and does give Habakkuk in this passages, and what God gives us is his presence. And in life, I think this is just good for us to know, something that we got to wrestle with, but I think it's good for us to know God gives us his presence more than he gives us answers. In your life, God's going to give you his presence more than he's going to give you the answers that you're seeking. And so the second thing that we see about God's response to Habakkuk and God's responses to our prayers is that God's answers don't always solve the tension. God's answers don't always solve the tension. The tension, no doubt, goes up after God responds. And just like whenever my pastor said, "This too shall pass," and it didn't help at all. Actually, in the moment, it made me even more frustrated. Like that tension, it doesn't go away whenever God responds all the time. No doubt, it actually was probably at a boiling point for Habakkuk when he says, "By the way, there's this evil army headed towards Israel." So God's answers, they don't always solve the tension. Remember, this is a series, what do we do when God doesn't? And God's answers aren't always the ones that we want. A clear statement from this passage. God's answers are not always the ones that we want. Verse 5, it's really kind of interesting. If you just took verse 5, this is kind of a lesson in making sure that you read the Bible in context. Because if you just take verse 5, and actually people do take verse 5, and they use it to like encourage someone who's struggling. And so someone will be like, "Man, I'm just having a really rough week." And then someone will go, "Hey, remember, God says this, look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe even if you were told." And they're like, "See, God has an amazing plan for your life." And you're kind of like, have you read Habakkuk? Like someone like in worship. So there's in worship, people will do this, and like everyone's lifting their hands like, "Wow, God, you're amazing. You are so amazing." And I'm like, God's literally saying, y'all don't know what y'all are saying right now. Y'all really don't want God to come through on the verse that was just read to you, okay? And so verse 5, it looks like this uplifting verse until you see the context around it, but it's anything but that, uplifting. Now, God does have a plan, but it's not the plan that you want. It's not the plan that you would have desired. Now, God is going to work things, and we're about to get there here in a second, but here in this moment, this is not what Habakkuk would have wanted or the people of Israel, and it's definitely not uplifting. And so with all that, God's response doesn't do certain things, but what does his response do for us? What are we to do? What are we to know? Well, his response to Habakkuk reminds us of some key truths, a couple of really key truths for us. And the first one is this, is that God is still in control. God is still in control. He says, I'm raising up this army. I'm raising up the Chaldeans. Maybe your version says the Babylonians. And I think it's absolutely key that we discuss and spend a little bit of time, that we figure out what it means when God says, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. Like, to what extent, so this is about God's reminding Habakkuk of his sovereignty. To what extent is God raising up the Chaldeans? To what extent is God, and sovereignty means God is in full control, ultimate control. He is reigning over all that happens in this world. He is sovereign. And so, to what extent, though? And maybe for you, you go, well, I don't feel the tension there. Okay, take the Chaldeans out and insert natural disasters. To what extent is God involved in that? Wicked rulers. To what extent is God involved with these wicked rulers that are in our world and have been in our world throughout history? Or a dozen other bad things that you could insert into that blank. To what extent? And so I want to spend some time answering the question, does this mean that God is making, does God being in control mean that God is making the Chaldeans do the evil things that they were doing? I had a conversation with a guy who was saying that God is in ultimate control, but also God is in control down to the minute detail. God is in control in every little thing, and he is working, and he is over in making every single detail happen. And I had a problem with that, and here's why. A church shooting had just taken place in San Antonio. This is a couple years ago. Some y'all probably all remember that happened, but the church shooting had just taken place, and I said, so God made the guy that shot up people in the church, killed so many people. God made that guy go in there? Like God in his sovereignty made that guy. And then I made it even a little bit more intense. I said, so let me ask you this. Is God the finger behind the finger that pulled the trigger? And so, and then I made my point, and the point I want to make tonight. Listen, that is a twisted view of God. That's a twisted view of God. Like I do not believe at all that God, and I don't think that Scripture teaches at all that God would do that God is the finger behind the finger that pulled the trigger. Like that's crazy to me that is what some people believe, but that's what some people believe. That's a twisted view of God. And I would also present to you that it's really, really difficult to believe that God is actually good, if that is what God is actually like. And so also to make the point even further from this passage, God calls the Chaldeans evil. So actually in chapter 2, which we're going to get to in this series, he actually judges the Chaldeans. And so he judges these people for their wickedness. And that doesn't make sense if God made them do it. So imagine me. So I have two little girls, one Bridget, one Cassie. So imagine Cassie walked over to Bridget like she does, because sometimes she's just gangster like that. She walks over and she just hits you. And so she walks over and she hits my daughter Bridget. And then I take Bridget's hand and I go, and I hit my daughter with it. Yes, if I did that, would anybody in here be like, that's a good dad? And then what if I said, don't hit your sister, you're going to timeout? And I took my daughter Bridget, after I made her hit Cassie, I took her to timeout and I said, you're going to get in timeout for hitting your sister. Y'all would be like, you need therapy. You need lots of therapy. There's a problem here. Listen, God doesn't do that. He is a good father. That's not the way that God is sovereign. That's not the way that we're to understand this. And so raising up the Chaldeans, it does not mean that God made them do the wicked acts that they were doing, that he is actually going to judge them for and say, woe to you in chapter 2. And so maybe you're asking, okay, well, how is God sovereign then? How is God ultimately in control then? Well, there's a quote I want to read by a guy named A.W. Tozer, old dead guy who said a lot of really good stuff. And it's a dense and it's a really heady quote, but I think it does make a really strong point. And so he says this. I think this is really good. He says, God sovereignly decreed that man should be free to exercise moral choice. And man from the beginning has fulfilled that decree by making his choice between good and evil. When he chooses to do evil, he does not thereby countervail the sovereign will of God, but fulfills it. Inasmuch as the eternal decree decided not which choice the man should make, but that he should be free to make it. Now that's the key highlight part of this. The eternal decree decided not which choice the man should make, but that he should be free to make it. If in his absolute freedom, God has willed to give man limited freedom, who is there to stay his hand or say, what dost thou? Man's will is free because God is sovereign. A God less than sovereign could not bestow moral freedom upon his creatures. He would be afraid to do so. So what is he saying? What is he teaching here? He's saying God in his sovereignty chose to give us choice. And that's why there's so much wickedness in this world. And that's why there's so many wicked armies in this world. And that's why there's so much brokenness in this world. Because God chose to give us choice. Now it's limited. We're limited in our, meaning God is still God. God reserves the right to intervene at any point, any time that he deems necessary or he desires to, because that's in definition what it means for him to be God. So it's limited, but God is teaching us that he gives choice, and that's why there's so much brokenness, and that's why this is happening. Now, with that said, here's what God is teaching with the raising up the Chaldeans. God is teaching that God uses even evil for his purposes. He uses even evil things and evil armies for his purposes. So it's like this. So God is a really good chess player. I got a chessboard here. Anybody play chess? Cool. Hey, listen, more than I thought maybe did. I definitely don't. And so I ask people what to do though. But God is like a really good chess player. So let's say, obviously, this is a you versus him or you versus her game. So you versus the opponent. So on this side, we'll say this represents God. This represents all that is good. This represents all that is right. This represents all that is holy. This represents all that we say that these are really, really good things, and the side of God. And this represents the side of evil. Okay, this represents all that is sinful, all that is wicked, all that is unrighteous, all that is broken in our world. And you could insert so many different things, but this represents evil. Now, here's how some people view God. They think that God comes, and I know I probably can't do this, but I'm just going to act like I'm moving, even if I can't. Can I do that? Can I move a pawn straight? Okay, so let's say, I'm on the side of good. I told you, I don't do this stuff. So God is on this side, and he's like, I'm going to make my move. And then some people think that God goes, and now I'm going to come and I'm going to make this move because I play both sides of the table. And some people think that God is just working all this and that this is just his own game and he is just working it all together, but he's on both sides. And I don't believe that that's true at all. God in his very character, he cannot be on that side. God is not on the side of evil at all. And by the way, also, whatever evil is made by evil against God or against you, if you're on the side of God, if you're on this side of the board saying, God, I want to follow you, you're a believer in Jesus, you are a child of God, you've been saved by Christ. If that's you, then whatever move evil makes against you, whether it be cancer, whether it be disease, whether it be the divorce, whether it be whatever brokenness, the neglect, the abuse that you went through, I don't know what it is, but whatever makes its move against you, there is a God on the other side, and he's undefeated, and he's for you, and he knows the move before it's made. He's not shocked by anything, and he is making moves against it, and he is making moves on your behalf and for his glory and for his purposes in this world. That's what we're about to go into, and that's really, really good news for us because all of us have had moves moved against us by evil, by brokenness, by the fact that we're in this sinful world. But God uses even evil for his purposes. He's not on both sides, but he does work within the parameters of this broken world to bring about his purposes for his glory and our good. And I was studying this passage with somebody, I guess this was probably months and months ago now, planning to preach this series. I've been planning to preach this series for quite some time. And he had been sexually molested. And as we were studying this, he got teary-eyed, and it was like early in the morning. We were just studying God's word together. Wasn't like an emotional thing, but for him, God started to really break through in this area because as we were studying, God broke through in this area where he wrestled with what he went through and what he innocently experienced happening to him whenever he was younger, and trying to reconcile that with what he believed about God. And it ended up being a breakthrough moment because he realized that God didn't make that move, but he can use that move to his advantage. And I'm telling you that that's so key for us to understand. Hey, in your life, there's going to be things that come against you. God didn't make that move, but he is going to use that move to his advantage. And so for you, I don't know what it is. I don't know if that peace that you would say is moving against you is depression, abuse, if it's divorce, death, because death is from sin, death in the family that really rocked you, cancer, betrayal. There's a God on the other side of the board, and he's moving to his advantage, and he's moving actually on your behalf. Romans 8:28 is a linchpin passage that I feel for good reason we just end up going to whenever we do these types of messages, but Romans 8:28, it says this, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. And I think there's a couple of key things to note here. It doesn't say that God causes all things. God doesn't cause all things, but he works all things. And then also, God doesn't call all things good. There's things that God would obviously call evil that he's still going to use for his purposes. I think the Chaldeans is an example of that. He doesn't call all things good, but he works all things for good. A few weeks ago, there's a guy that has recently joined our leadership team, Christian. He shared his testimony up here, and he shared about how whenever he was little, he started having seizures, and also that he had lost his mom, died, and also that his sister had passed away. And so in the middle of all that, he was wearing a shirt and he talked, and it was like one of those really tough stories to hear because he had struggled through so much, but he's wearing a shirt and across his chest was the word joy. And he talked about how he has joy in Jesus and that how he has found Christ and how Christ really has found him and how it's changed everything for him. And now he has this joy in Christ. And I think the question that we've got to ask is how? How do you have joy like that? How do you have joy whenever you have a story like that? And here's why, because he knows this truth that we've been unpacking. He is in the hands of this sovereign God that we're talking about. This sovereign God who's really good at chess and that is making move no matter what is made against you, no matter what is moving against you, he's going to work it because he's already infinity moves ahead of what's going to happen to you. God's not shocked by any of it, and he has his plan in place, and it can't be stopped. It can't be thwarted. Now, with all that said, a key observation in all this for this passage is obviously says, I'm raising them up and they're coming for Israel. Here's the problem with the Israelites. They're on the wrong side of the board. The Israelites are living wickedly. They're living in sin. They're living against God. And Habakkuk is a man who's trying to seek the Lord in a culture that's not, just like a lot of you are. You're trying to seek God, but we are in a culture that is not seeking God. And so God uses the Chaldeans, this wicked, evil vessel, as an instrument for his justice. This is how God is using the Chaldeans. And Habakkuk realizes this. We see this in his response in verse 12. He says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? So God is holy. He is set apart from us. He is on another level, meaning so like Habakkuk is recognizing in this moment, hey, like I know I see through a really small peephole and that you see the whole picture. You're on another level from me. You are holy, my Holy One. And he says, we shall not die. Oh Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment. So God is also the judge and the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and he is the righteous judge of this world. And then he says this, and you, O rock. Man, I love that he calls God the rock, because whenever a Christian hits rock bottom, they're still held by Jesus. You, O rock, have established them for reproof. And he says, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. He's saying, like, I believe there's some powerful truths. You're the pure one. No stain in you. No wickedness in you. But then he says this, because maybe you're here and you're going, wait a second, I still have questions. That's interesting because that's exactly what Habakkuk does. He says, listen, I still have questions. Habakkuk ends with Habakkuk asking more questions. He's saying, I believe your character, but I still have questions. And this is where the chapter ends. And the tension is still there and the tension is still remaining. And I'm telling you that there's going to be chapters in our lives where this is where we're at. That we're hanging on, holding on to God, but the tension is still there. But he's hanging on. And so will we hang in there? And maybe you're not in a place where you're struggling deeply right now, but maybe you are. But regardless, when you hit those places, will you hang in there? That's the question for us. Like whenever I was hanging on the pull-up bar and I was holding myself up with everything that I've got, will you hold on to your faith with everything that you've got? And here's the good news that I didn't say yet, and it's this, is that whenever you are hanging on and you hang on to your faith with all that you've got, God comes alongside you and God holds you up. When you hang on, God holds you up. That's really, really good news for us tonight, because it's not just us all by ourselves, pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps and making it happen. No, God comes alongside and he says, I'm going to hold you up now. Hang on with all you've got as I hold you. And as we close, the word Habakkuk, the actual word itself, it means this. It means to wrestle or to embrace. It's fascinating. It means to wrestle or to embrace. This is the invitation of Habakkuk. And God is inviting us, will we wrestle with these things that we struggle with the question box, with the things that are being moved against us? What does it look like to wrestle? It means that you hang on to God with all that you've got, and it means that you enter faith. And I said this earlier last semester, but it means that you enter faith into the question, even if it means questioning your faith. Will you enter faith into the question, even if it means questioning your faith? Will you wrestle? And then will you embrace? Will you hold on to God? I was listening to a pastor share not that long ago, and he said this sentence that really stuck out to me. He said, I've learned enough about God to trust him when I don't understand. I've learned enough about God that I'm going to trust him even whenever I don't understand. So will you wrestle and will you embrace as you hang on? And maybe you're here and you're thinking, why hang on? And I've had that question actually said to me many, many times, even over this year. Why should I continue on? I don't know if I want to continue on dealing with all that I'm dealing with. I don't know if I'm just I think I'm ready maybe just to walk out and leave God behind for the time being, because I don't know if I want to hang on. Why hang on? Listen, in chess, sometimes to get the ultimate victory, a player will take one of the most powerful pieces, the queen, and a person will sacrifice the queen. Why? In order to get ultimate victory. And maybe you're here. And maybe you're thinking, man, I feel like I'm just a pawn in a game that God's playing. I feel like God doesn't care. Am I just a pawn and God's just moving wherever he wants? And I'm telling you, listen, hey, you're not a pawn. You're not just a pawn. You're actually the prize, is what Scripture says, that you aren't the pawn, you're the prize. Jesus says for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. And that joy that he's describing when he says that is you and me, and the fact that he would save us. So God says that you are actually my prize. God did not sacrifice you. God actually sacrificed him. Jesus is the one that was sacrificed. So that way God could get ultimate victory. It looked like all was lost when Jesus was on the cross, but then God gave his son in order to sacrifice so he could save us, die in our place where we deserve to die, so we could be saved and have a relationship with the God of the universe and be made clean. So the water that you saw people getting baptized with, that is just a symbol that they have been washed of their sins. That required that somebody else take the payment for our sin, and Jesus did that. And God, as Satan came against God, as evil, the ultimate move of evil came against Jesus, and Jesus died on the cross. It looked like all was lost, but then 3 days later, what happened? God rose. And when he rose, he showed that he is the one who is victorious. He is the one who reigns. And God sacrificed himself. He entered the board and he sacrifices himself on the cross. Why? So he could save you, because he loves you. Listen, you're hanging on to the one who was hung on a cross for you. That's why you hang on. Let's pray. God, for those who are struggling now, I pray that you would help them wrestle and embrace. Help them to hang on as you hold them up. Lord, help us to wrestle with these truths that we talked about tonight. And God, I thank you that you are good, that you are working, and that you do have a plan, even if it's a plan that is going to require us going through some things that we don't want to go through. Just like Habakkuk, you're still working. If you want to talk to someone, there's a prayer team in the back. Maybe you don't know Jesus and you can surrender your life to him even now. You just say yes to God. You feel God pulling at you. Just say yes to God. Let's worship.